What if this glorious attack is not the final word, but the first page of a story we don't have the ink to finish? This sense of a finite destiny was the unspoken truth at the heart of Japan's grand strategy in late 1941. The architect of the Pearl Harbor attack, Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, was a man of profound contradictions. He had served as a naval attaché in Washington. He had seen the sprawling factories of Detroit. He knew with chilling certainty that Japan could never win a prolonged war against the industrial might of the United States. His entire audacious plan was therefore not a strategy for victory, but a desperate gamble for a negotiated peace. The goal was to land a single, staggering blow that would shatter American morale and force them to the table, leaving Japan free to consolidate its new empire in Southeast Asia. This single strike was an expression of a deeply ingrained institutional belief within the Imperial Japanese Navy, the doctrine of the Kantai Kessen, the decisive battle. For decades, Japanese naval officers had been trained to seek out and annihilate the enemy fleet in one cataclysmic engagement. A modern replay of their legendary victory over the Russian fleet at Tsushima in 1905. Every ship was designed, every sailor trained for this one perfect moment of naval combat. This philosophy prioritized offensive firepower and warrior spirit, the Yamato Damashi, above all else. Logistics, maintenance, and the grinding realities of a long-term war of attrition were seen as secondary concerns, problems to be solved after the decisive victory had been won. And so, in the frozen quiet of Hitokapu Bay in the Kuril Islands, the ultimate tool for this decisive battle was assembled. Under the command of Vice Admiral Chuichi Nagumo, the Kido Butai, the First Air Fleet, slipped its moorings and vanished into the fog. It was a force of unprecedented power. 6 aircraft carriers, the Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, Hiryu, Shokaku, and Zukaku, carrying over 400 of the world's most advanced combat aircraft. For 10 days, this armada maintained absolute radio silence, a ghost fleet steaming toward Hawaii, its existence a secret from the entire world. The plan, meticulously crafted by the brilliant aviator Commander Minoru Genda, was a masterpiece of tactical precision. Wave after wave of bombers and fighters would descend upon the unsuspecting American naval base at Pearl Harbor. Their primary targets were the monolithic battleships of the U.S. Pacific Fleet, moored in neat rows along Ford Island. To the Japanese planners, these ships were the heart of American sea power, their destruction a blow from which the enemy could not recover. Captain Kameto Kuroshima, Yamamoto's eccentric but visionary staff officer, saw this as the only way forward. The American oil embargo of July 26, 1941, had started a clock. Japan's war machine would grind to a halt without the oil of the Dutch East Indies. War was not a choice, it was an inevitability. The only question was how it would begin. This attack was the answer, a calculated risk born of desperation, a surgical strike designed to cripple a giant. But surgery requires precision, and even the most brilliant surgeon can miss a vital artery if they are looking in the wrong place. At dawn, on December the 7th, 1941, the Japanese wager was placed. The flight decks of Nagumo's carriers turned into a maelstrom of controlled chaos as Zero fighters, Kate torpedo bombers, and Val dive bombers roared to life. In 2 waves, 353 aircraft ascended into the Hawaiian sky, their pilots filled with a sense of historic purpose. What followed was one of the most successful surprise attacks in military history. The American battleships, symbols of a nation's power, were turned into helpless victims. The Arizona was obliterated by a catastrophic magazine explosion. The Oklahoma capsized, trapping hundreds of men inside. The West Virginia and California sank at their moorings. In less than 2 hours, the Japanese pilots had achieved their primary objective with stunning efficiency. The pride of the U.S. Pacific Fleet was a collection of smoking, twisted steel, resting on the shallow bottom of the harbor. For the pilots returning to their carriers, and for Vice Admiral Nagumo watching from the bridge of the Akagi, it was a picture of total victory. The decisive battle doctrine had been vindicated in a single, perfectly executed strike. But as the second-wave aircraft were recovered, the flight crews began preparing for the next strike. The pilots were eager, their confidence soaring. They knew the real strategic prize was still there for the taking. Yet on the flag bridge, Chuichi Nagumo hesitated. He was a cautious man, a battleship admiral at heart, thrust into command of this new and radical form of warfare. He had already won an unprecedented victory, accomplishing what his superiors had demanded. Against the strenuous objections of his subordinates, including Genda, the order was given. The Kido Butai turned for home, leaving the most important target in Pearl Harbor completely untouched. This decision, born of caution, was a strategic blunder of epic proportions. The sunken battleships, while a devastating blow to American morale, were largely obsolete vessels from a bygone era of naval warfare. The fuel tanks, however, were the key to the entire Pacific theater. Admiral Chester Nimitz, who would soon arrive to take command amidst the wreckage, later remarked that the Japanese had made a fatal error. Had they destroyed the oil, he stated, the war would have been prolonged for at least 2 more years. Without that fuel, the surviving American ships, including the all-important aircraft carriers, would have been forced to retreat to the ports of San Diego and San Francisco, 5,000 miles away. The Pacific Ocean in its entirety would have become a Japanese lake. By focusing on the steel hulls of the battleships instead of the oil that powered them, Nagumo had won the battle but created the conditions for losing the war. He had destroyed the sword, but left the enemy's arm, and the means to forge a new and deadlier weapon, fully intact. The first entry in Japan's logistical ledger had been written, not in the black ink of victory, but in the invisible red ink of a catastrophic miscalculation. Nagumo's choice at Pearl Harbor was not merely the failure of a single commander. It was the first most visible crack in an entire intellectual architecture of ruin. The decision to spare the American fuel reserves stemmed from a series of deeply flawed core assumptions upon which Japan had built its entire war plan. These were not simple mistakes in arithmetic. They were profound errors in understanding the very nature of the conflict they were about to unleash. The entire edifice of their Pacific strategy rested on 3 pillars of sand, each one a testament to an institutional culture that valued optimism and fighting spirit over brutal, objective analysis. The first and most critical of these assumptions was the belief that the war would be short. The high command in Tokyo, including men like Captain Kameto Kuroshima, envisioned a conflict lasting no more than 6 months to a year. They believed that the shock of Pearl Harbor, followed by a rapid string of victories across Southeast Asia and the Pacific, would break the American will to fight. In their view, the United States was a materialistic, decadent society that lacked the spiritual fortitude for a protracted, bloody struggle. A swift, negotiated peace, they calculated, was inevitable. This fantasy of a limited war fatally skewed every logistical projection they made. Why stockpile vast reserves of fuel? Why build hundreds of replacement tankers? Why plan for a war of attrition when the enemy would surely sue for peace before the first year was out. The second pillar was a direct extension of the first, the unwavering faith in the decisive battle doctrine as the sole model for naval operations. The planners calculated fuel consumption based on a war composed of short, intense sorties, culminating in a single, climactic fleet action. They budgeted for ships steaming from a home base, engaging the enemy, and returning. What they utterly failed to anticipate was the reality of a Pacific-wide war. This new conflict would not be a series of set-piece battles, but a continuous, grinding contest of logistics and presence. It would require endless patrols across millions of square miles of ocean, constant convoy escort duties, long-range amphibious invasions, and high-tempo carrier operations that kept the fleet at sea for months at a time. The actual fuel consumption rate under these real-world combat conditions would prove to be not just slightly higher, but 3 to 4 times greater than their peacetime estimates. Their spreadsheets described a sprint, but they had just entered a marathon with only enough energy planned for the first 100 yards. This fundamental misreading of operational tempo was a direct consequence of their obsession with a single, glorious battle to the exclusion of all other possibilities. The third pillar was the deceptively simple solution to their one acknowledged weakness, the lack of domestic oil. The entire southern operation, the lightning conquest of Malaya, the Philippines, and Singapore, was a prelude to seizing the ultimate prize, the oil-rich Dutch East Indies. On paper, the logic was flawless. The fields in Borneo and Sumatra could produce far more crude oil than Japan's war machine could ever consume. To the strategists in Tokyo, it was a simple problem of acquisition. Once the fields were captured, the oil would flow, and Japan's one great vulnerability would be erased forever. They envisioned a future where the Imperial Navy's fuel gauges were always full, powering an unstoppable expansion. This triad of miscalculation, the short war fantasy, the decisive battle obsession, and the guaranteed oil solution formed a closed and tragically flawed loop of logic. Each error reinforced the others, creating a powerful narrative of swift and certain victory that left no room for doubt or contingency. It was a plan for the perfect war, and it was about to collide with a very imperfect reality. In the opening months of 1942, the Japanese war machine seemed unstoppable, a testament to the perceived brilliance of their strategy. The rising sun flag was hoisted over Hong Kong, Manila, Singapore, and Rangoon. The great British warships, Repulse and Prince of Wales, were sent to the bottom of the South China Sea by naval aviation, sounding a death knell for the age of the battleship. And in March, Japanese forces landed and secured their primary strategic objective, the Dutch East Indies. On paper, it was the final, triumphant move in their master plan. The source of their one great vulnerability was now firmly in their grasp. The planners in Tokyo could almost hear the gush of crude oil that would fuel their empire for 1,000 years. But when the Japanese occupation forces arrived at the sprawling oil facilities of Borneo and Sumatra, they were not greeted by the hum of machinery, but by an eerie, smoking silence. They had captured the territory, but the prize itself had been systematically destroyed. The retreating Dutch and Allied engineers had executed a scorched earth policy of breathtaking thoroughness and ingenuity. This was not simple battlefield sabotage. It was the work of experts who knew the intricate heart of the petroleum industry. They hadn't just blown up pipelines and set fire to storage tanks. They had dynamited the delicate, cracking towers of the refineries, turning them into unsalvageable scrap metal. They had dropped dismantled machinery down the wellheads and then filled the shafts with tons of concrete, creating plugs hundreds of feet deep. In some cases, they had even welded the wellheads shut from the inside out using specialized tools. To the Japanese engineers who followed, it was a scene of industrial carnage. They had planned to simply turn a key and restart production. Instead, they were faced with a colossal reconstruction project, one for which they were utterly unprepared. The specialized drilling bits, the high-pressure pumps, the complex refinery components, all were unique products of the American and European petroleum industries. Japan possessed neither the stockpiles of spare parts nor the domestic industrial base to replicate them quickly. The result was a logistical quagmire. The teams of Japanese engineers, though dedicated and hard-working, were fighting a losing battle against time and technology. They spent months painstakingly trying to drill out concrete plugs or reverse engineer complex components from mangled wreckage. Their progress was agonizingly slow. The pre-war projections, the very foundation of their long-term strategy, had assumed that the Dutch East Indies would be supplying Japan with nearly 50 million barrels of oil per year almost immediately. The reality was a grim shadow of this fantasy. By 1943, after a full year of desperate work, they had managed to restore production to less than half of that anticipated volume. The great gusher of oil that was meant to secure their destiny had been reduced to a disappointing trickle. The third pillar of their strategy had crumbled into dust. This shortfall was not just a minor setback. It was a fundamental rupture in the logistical chain that was supposed to sustain the entire war effort. The Empire had swallowed the prize, but it could not digest it. And this created a second, equally devastating problem that the planners had almost completely ignored. Even this reduced amount of oil was useless sitting in storage tanks in Sumatra. It had to be transported thousands of miles across a hostile ocean, back to the naval bases in Truk and Kur, and to the refineries in the Japanese home islands. The blood had been drawn, but the arteries to carry it to the heart of the empire were fragile, few in number, and about to become the single most hunted target in the entire Pacific Ocean. The failure to secure the expected output from the Indies was the first sign of a terminal illness. The inability to protect the sea lanes that carried what little they had would be the fatal stroke. While Japanese engineers struggled in the tropical heat of the Indies, another critical miscalculation was beginning to manifest itself on the high seas. This error was perhaps the most elementary of all, the simple failure to count the necessary number of ships. In the rush to plan the glorious decisive battles and amphibious invasions, the humble oil tanker, the workhorse of any modern navy, had been treated as an afterthought. Japanese war planners had drastically underestimated the sheer volume of shipping required to sustain a trans-Pacific war. They allocated enough tankers to support their idealized vision of a short conflict with limited naval sorties, but nowhere near enough for the sprawling, high-consumption reality they had created. This initial deficit was a problem, but it was the institutional mindset behind it that would prove truly catastrophic. The Imperial Japanese Navy, steeped in the samurai tradition of the offensive, viewed commerce raiding and the defense of merchant shipping as fundamentally dishonorable. The role of a naval officer was to seek glorious combat with enemy warships, not to shepherd slow, vulnerable tankers across empty stretches of ocean. Consequently, they developed almost no effective anti-submarine warfare doctrine. The American Navy, by stark contrast, had a very different view. Stung by the humiliation of Pearl Harbor and unable to challenge the Japanese fleet in a surface action for nearly a year, they turned to the one weapon they could deploy immediately and effectively, their submarine force. Unleashing their Yamato-class submarines with the order to wage unrestricted warfare, they targeted the long, predictable shipping lanes between Southeast Asia and Japan. This was the logistical artery of the Japanese Empire, and the American submariners became predators, turning areas like the Luzon Strait into a deadly hunting ground they grimly nicknamed Convoy College. The Japanese response was tragically inadequate. Their convoy systems were poorly organized, often consisting of just one or two outdated destroyers to protect a dozen merchant ships. Their sonar and radar technology lagged far behind the Allies, and their use of depth charges was often ineffective. They treated the loss of tankers and merchantmen as an unfortunate but secondary consequence of war, failing to grasp that each sinking was a direct blow to their ability to continue the fight. The numbers tell a story of relentless, systematic destruction. In 1942, the American submarine campaign was just getting started, sinking a manageable number of ships. But by 1943, as more submarines arrived and their commanders grew more experienced and aggressive, the losses began to mount exponentially. Tankers that had miraculously survived the long journey from Sumatra to Japan would be torpedoed and sunk within sight of their home ports. The slow, unescorted vessels were easy targets. American submarine skippers would lie in wait along the known routes, sometimes firing entire spreads of 10 torpedoes at a single large tanker to ensure its destruction. For the Japanese merchant sailors, the voyage became a terrifying ordeal. A sudden explosion, a column of water and fire, and a ship laden with tens of thousands of barrels of precious crude oil would slip beneath the waves in minutes. There was no glory, only the cold, dark water of the Pacific. This campaign of attrition was brutally effective, creating a choke point that no amount of fighting spirit could overcome. Japan had started the war with a barely adequate tanker fleet, and now that fleet was being systematically annihilated. Of the 25 brand-new high-speed tankers Japan built during the entire war, every single one was at the bottom of the ocean by August of 1945. The oil that was being painstakingly extracted from the sabotaged wells in Borneo was now, in ever-increasing amounts, simply fueling immense bonfires on the surface of the sea. The logistical chain was not just ruptured, it was being dismembered, link by agonizing link. The strategic planners had failed to anticipate the problem, the naval command had failed to counter it, and now the entire war effort was beginning to starve. The blood pressure of the empire was dropping, and there was nothing they could do to stop the bleeding. By early 1944, the cumulative effect of these logistical failures had transformed from a chronic problem into an acute, paralyzing crisis. The Japanese war machine was running on fumes. The numbers, when laid bare, reveal a deficit so profound that it made a mockery of any grand strategic ambitions. The Imperial Navy's minimum operational requirement to maintain a credible combat footing was approximately 40 million barrels of fuel oil per year. Yet due to the combination of lower-than-expected production in the Indies and the catastrophic shipping losses from the American submarine campaign, the actual amount reaching Japan and its forward bases was hovering around 25 million barrels, and that number was decreasing with each passing month. This wasn't a gap that could be bridged with conservation or efficiency. It was a vast, unfillable chasm between the demands of a total war and the reality of a collapsed supply chain. The consequences of this fuel famine were felt at every level of the Imperial Navy, slowly strangling its ability to fight. The first and most immediate impact was on training. A navy is not just a collection of ships. It is a highly complex system of skilled human beings, and those skills require constant practice. For a carrier pilot, proficiency demands hundreds of hours in the air. For a battleship's gunnery crew, it requires firing thousands of shells. But practice consumes fuel, and fuel had become more precious than ammunition. Pilot training programs were slashed. New aviators, meant to replace the irreplaceable veterans lost at Midway and in the Solomons, were sent into combat with shockingly few flight hours. They were less skilled at navigation, less accurate in their bombing, and less capable of surviving the brutal dogfights against increasingly experienced American pilots. On the great warships, training exercises were curtailed or canceled altogether. Gunnery practice became a rare luxury. Ships that once patrolled vast sectors of the ocean were now confined to their anchorages for weeks, their engines cold, their crews idle. The razor-sharp edge of the force that had shattered Pearl Harbor was being systematically dulled, not by enemy action, but by the simple lack of fuel in their own tanks. This operational paralysis forced the Japanese High Command into a series of desperate and ultimately disastrous strategic choices. Fleets that should have been concentrated at the main base of Truk Lagoon were instead dispersed, with heavy combat units like the battleship Yamato often kept closer to the sources of fuel in Singapore or Borneo. This division of forces violated a fundamental principle of naval warfare and made it impossible to mount a swift, coordinated response to American offensives. When the U.S. Navy launched its island-hopping campaign across the Central Pacific, the Japanese response was often piecemeal and sluggish, hampered by the constant, agonizing calculus of fuel expenditure. Every sortie had to be carefully weighed. Could they afford the fuel to challenge this landing? Could they risk the tankers required to refuel the fleet for the return journey? More often than not, the answer was no. The once feared Imperial Navy was being reduced to a fleet in being that existed more as a theoretical threat on a map than as an actual fighting force on the water. This grim reality bred a culture of extreme risk-taking. With fuel for only one major operation, every battle had to be the decisive battle. The undertrained Japanese pilots were slaughtered in what the Americans jubilantly called the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot. Japan lost 3 carriers and over 600 aircraft, a blow from which their naval aviation would never recover. The seeds of this defeat were sown months earlier, in the empty fuel tanks that had kept their pilots on the ground instead of in the air, practicing their craft. The logistical math had become an inescapable verdict. The war was not being lost in the fiery chaos of battle, but in the quiet, desperate accounting of fuel reserves that were dwindling to zero. The final tragic act in this drama of logistical collapse was the death ride of the battleship Yamato. By the spring of 1945, the situation was beyond hopeless. American forces had captured Iwo Jima and were now landing on Okinawa, the final stepping stone to the Japanese home islands. The once mighty combined fleet was a ghost of its former self, with most of its carriers sunk and its surviving ships immobilized at the Kure naval base, rusting at anchor for lack of fuel. Yet in a move that perfectly encapsulated the triumph of warrior spirit over rational thought, the Imperial High Command decided to sortie its last remaining capital ships in a suicidal mission codenamed Operation Tengu. The super battleship Yamato, the largest and most powerful battleship ever built, was to steam towards Okinawa and beach herself on the coast, acting as an unsinkable gun battery to contest the American landing. It was a mission born of pure desperation, a final defiant gesture from a navy that had nothing left to give. The logistical planning for this one final sortie was a grim parody of the Navy's former might. The fuel officers scoured the dregs of every storage tank in the naval district, pumping out the sludge and residue to gather just enough low-quality fuel for the Yamato and her small escort of 1 light cruiser and 8 destroyers to make the journey. There was no consideration for a return trip. This was a one-way mission. The ship that had been conceived as the ultimate symbol of Japanese sea power, the vessel that was supposed to win the decisive battle, was being sent to her death with just enough fuel to reach the battlefield. Her cavernous bunkers, designed to hold enough oil to carry her across the Pacific and back, were mostly empty. As she slipped out of the inland sea on April 6, 1945, she was not just a warship embarking on a mission. She was a floating testament to the complete and utter failure of a nation's ability to supply its own war machine. Every turn of her massive propellers was consuming a resource that no longer existed in the Empire's strategic reserves. The American response was swift and overwhelming. Having broken Japanese naval codes, they knew exactly where the Yamato was and where she was going. On the morning of April 7th, the first of nearly 400 American carrier aircraft descended upon the tiny task force. The Japanese sailors, armed with a fearsome array of anti-aircraft guns, fought back with incredible courage, but they were hopelessly outmatched. Without air cover of their own, a direct consequence of the fuel crisis that had grounded their air fleets and decimated their pilot training programs, the Yamato was a helpless giant. Wave after wave of American Avenger torpedo bombers and Helldiver dive bombers executed coordinated attacks, a textbook display of the naval air power that Japan had pioneered and America had perfected. Torpedoes tore gaping holes in the battleship's thinly protected underside, while armor-piercing bombs smashed her superstructure and disabled her gun directors. The end was inevitable. Listing heavily, her speed dropping, the Yamato became an easy target. After absorbing an estimated 19 torpedoes and 17 direct bomb hits, the order was given to abandon ship. Shortly thereafter, the mighty vessel capsized and a colossal internal explosion, likely from her main magazines, ripped the ship in two, sending a mushroom cloud of smoke and fire thousands of feet into the air. With her went over 3,000 of her crew. The sinking of the Yamato was more than just the loss of a ship. It was the symbolic funeral of the Imperial Japanese Navy. The ultimate weapon of the decisive battle doctrine had been destroyed by an enemy it could not even see, on a mission it could not have returned from even if it had been successful. She was sunk not only by American bombs and torpedoes, but by the invisible hand of logistical starvation that had reached out across the years, a direct consequence of the flawed assumptions and mathematical errors made in Tokyo long before a single shot was fired. The story of Japan's logistical self-destruction is ultimately a story of institutional culture. The catastrophic miscalculations were not born from a lack of intelligence, but from an abundance of a specific kind of thinking, a mindset that consistently and deliberately subordinated objective reality to the ideals of warrior spirit and tradition. At the heart of the Imperial Japanese Navy was the Yamato Damashi, the unshakable belief in the spiritual power of the Japanese people. This was not simply patriotism. It was a deeply held conviction that willpower, courage, and a willingness to die could overcome any material disadvantage. While this ethos produced soldiers and sailors of incredible bravery, it also created an intellectual climate where inconvenient facts were often ignored or dismissed. Planners who raised concerns about logistical shortfalls or questioned optimistic projections were often seen as cowardly or defeatist. The prevailing attitude was that spirit and a bold offensive stroke would solve any problem. This cultural bias was the fertile ground in which the seeds of disaster were sown. This mindset explains why Admiral Nagumo, a product of this very system, could look upon the blazing battleships at Pearl Harbor and see a complete victory while remaining blind to the strategic gold shimmering in the nearby fuel tanks. The destruction of enemy warships was a tangible, glorious result that fit perfectly within the decisive battle narrative. The destruction of infrastructure was a secondary, less glorious task. The warrior's instinct was to strike the enemy's sword arm, not his supply wagon. This same cultural lens explains the utter failure to develop effective anti-submarine warfare. The task of protecting merchants was seen as a defensive, reactive, and therefore less honorable duty compared to the glory of a surface engagement. The best officers and the newest equipment were consistently allocated to the fleet's combatant ships, while the vital task of convoy escort was relegated to second-rate ships and crews. They were building a magnificent spearhead, but they had forgotten that the strongest spear is useless if its shaft is made of rotting wood. This triumph of spirit over spreadsheet was evident in every flawed assumption. The belief in a short war was rooted in the idea that the American spirit was weak and would break easily. The obsession with a single, decisive battle was a romanticized vision of war that ignored the grinding, industrial nature of modern conflict. The assumption that the Dutch East Indies oil would be an easy prize was a failure to respect the enemy's ingenuity and resolve. In each case, the desired outcome, one that aligned with the glory of the Japanese martial tradition, was allowed to dictate the strategic analysis. Captain Kameto Kuroshima, a key planner for Yamato, was known for his brilliant, but often reckless and intuitive, leaps of logic. He embodied a system that prized audacity over careful, methodical planning. When confronted with the stark numbers of American industrial output, Japanese leaders would often fall back on the unquantifiable metric of spiritual strength. It was a form of magical thinking applied to the unforgiving science of war. In the end, the Pacific War became a brutal lesson in the cold arithmetic of logistics. The United States, on the other hand, approached the conflict as a problem of industrial engineering. They built thousands of escort carriers, destroyer escorts, and Liberty ships. They perfected underway replenishment, allowing their fleets to remain at sea indefinitely. They waged a systematic, data-driven campaign against Japan's supply lines, identifying the critical choke point and applying relentless pressure. While Japan focused on the art of the perfect battle, America perfected the science of the long war. The conflict was not a duel between samurai and cowboys. It was a contest between a warrior culture and an industrial one. And in the 20th century, the factory, the oil well, and the calculator would prove to be far more powerful weapons than the sword. Japan's defeat was not sealed in August of 1945, but in the pre-war planning rooms where the fatal math was done, and spirit was mistakenly entered as a positive integer on the wrong side of the ledger. As the war drew to its inevitable conclusion in the summer of 1945, the final state of Japan's logistical paralysis was laid bare. It was a nation not just defeated, but comprehensively immobilized. The last vestiges of the Imperial Navy were trapped in their harbors. not by American blockades, but by their own empty fuel gauges. What remained of their once proud aircraft carriers, cruisers and destroyers, were being used as stationary, anti-aircraft platforms, their engines cold for months, their crews helpless to do anything but await the next bombing raid. In the skies, the situation was even more dire. The famed Zero fighters, which had once swept all opposition from the skies, were now being filled with a crude ersatz fuel distilled from pine tree roots. This low-quality fuel damaged engines, reduced performance, and was a key factor in the appalling number of non-combat accidents that plagued the final months of the war. Pilots were dying not just from enemy fire, but from simple engine failure, caused by the desperate attempt to power their machines with anything that would burn. This complete logistical breakdown had a profound impact on the final, desperate defensive doctrine of Japan, the Kamikaze. While often portrayed as a purely fanatical expression of the Bushido Code, the systematic use of suicide attacks was also a grimly practical response to the fuel crisis. Japan no longer had the reserves of high-octane aviation fuel, nor the cadres of experienced pilots to engage in conventional air combat. A kamikaze attack was, in a brutal calculus, a more efficient use of scarce resources. A rookie pilot with minimal training, flying a stripped-down aircraft carrying just enough pine root fuel for a one-way trip, could still potentially sink a multi-million-dollar American warship. It was a tactical solution born directly from strategic bankruptcy. Every kamikaze plane that roared down on the American fleet at Okinawa was a symbol of a nation that had run out of options, run out of trained men, and most critically, run out of oil. It was the final, horrifying expression of a strategy that had always prioritized the single, decisive blow over the sustainability required for a prolonged conflict. Even on the home front, the oil famine had brought the nation to a standstill. Civilian gasoline rationing had long since ceased. There was simply no fuel for private vehicles. The nation's fishing fleet, vital for feeding the population, was largely idle, leading to severe food shortages. Industries that had once produced the world's most advanced warships and aircraft were struggling to operate as the coal and oil needed to power them dwindled. The inter-island ferries and coastal shipping that formed the backbone of the domestic economy were sporadic at best. Japan was not just losing a war on a distant frontier, it was slowly shutting down from within. The American submarine campaign had not only severed the artery from the Dutch East Indies, but had also turned the waters around Japan itself into a no-go zone, isolating the nation and ensuring its internal collapse. When the first American occupation troops arrived in August of 1945, they found a country that had already ground to a halt. In retrospect, the entire Pacific War can be viewed through this single lens of energy logistics. Japan's initial successes were powered by a small, finite stockpile of fuel, a strategic reserve they burned through with astonishing speed in their quest for a quick victory. When that quick victory failed to materialize, and when the expected gusher of captured oil was reduced to a trickle, the countdown clock that had been ticking since before Pearl Harbor began to accelerate. Every decision, from the dispersal of the fleet to the final kamikaze attacks, was dictated by the ever-present, ever-worsening fuel shortage. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, the man who had warned against a long war with America, had been tragically prophetic. The industrial giant he had so respected had not been broken by a single blow. Instead, it had methodically and patiently squeezed the life out of his empire, not by shattering its sword, but by simply draining the energy from the warrior's arm, until it could no longer lift its weapon. The war ended, not with a bang of a decisive battle, but with the quiet, sputtering whimper of an engine running out of fuel. The intricate story of the Pacific War, with its legendary carrier duels and brutal island campaigns, can ultimately be reduced to a single, unassailable truth. The war was not decided at Midway or Guadalcanal, but in the quiet planning rooms of Tokyo years before the first bomb fell. It was a conflict lost on paper, a defeat guaranteed by a series of fundamental mathematical errors rooted in a culture that refused to let reality interfere with its ambitions. The fall of the Japanese Empire was not a failure of courage, but a failure of calculation. It serves as one of history's most stark reminders that the heart of a war machine is not its steel armor or its explosive shells, but the unglamorous, indispensable flow of fuel that gives it life. While Japan fielded some of the most formidable weapons and bravest warriors of the Second World War, they were in command of a body that was, from the very beginning, suffering from a terminal disease of logistical anemia. The fatal math error, then, was not a single incorrect number, but an entire flawed equation for modern warfare. The Japanese formula was heavily weighted with variables for warrior spirit, tactical surprise, and the quest for a single, glorious battle. What it failed to properly account for were the brutal, unromantic constants of industrial output, resource availability, and the grinding mathematics of attrition. They had calculated, with beautiful precision, how to win the first day of the war. They had no viable calculation for how to sustain the second, let alone the 1,344 days that would follow. The United States, in contrast, built its entire war effort on a different kind of math. It was the math of the factory floor, the production schedule, and the convoy timetable. America's ultimate victory was not forged in the dramatic crucible of battle, but in the methodical, relentless, and overwhelming power of its logistical chain. It weaponized its economy, turning out ships, planes, and most importantly, the tankers to fuel them at a rate that Japan could not even comprehend, let alone match. This legacy stands as a timeless and sobering lesson. A nation's military power is a complex ecosystem, and the most visible predators, the battleships, the carriers, the elite soldiers, are utterly dependent on the vast, often invisible network of supply that nourishes them. A military that prioritizes the aesthetics of combat over the science of sustainment is building a hollow force. It may win spectacular initial victories, but it lacks the resilience to endure the inevitable counterpunches and the long, exhausting struggle that defines modern, great power conflict. The story of Japan's oil crisis is a testament to the fact that no amount of fighting spirit can propel a fleet that has run out of fuel. No amount of heroism can save a nation that has wagered its entire existence on a short war and then finds itself trapped in a long one with empty tanks. The smoke that rose from the sinking wreck of the super battleship Yamato in 1945 was not just the funeral pyre of a single ship, but the final, dramatic symbol of an empire that had been defeated, fundamentally, by a simple, brutal, and unforgiving error in its math.